The Reeve's Tale, a Racket at the Mill. There was once a crook of a miller called Matthew. He owned the only mill for miles around, so that he could rob his customers daily, and still they had to bring their corn to him for grinding. But there were two students, Bright and Spark, living locally. They decided that they had brains enough between them to outwit the old scoundrel and pay him back for some of his double dealing. How could they know that a miller's not just as greedy as a hole in the ground, but as slippery as a handful of butter as well? Bright and Spark brought their corn to the mill on horseback and set it down, 2 big sacks filled to bursting, by the millstone. Then they sat down on the floor. "That's all right, boys," said Matthew. "No need to hang around. I'll call you when it's ready." "We'll stay." "Thank you," they replied, and fixed their eyes on the miller, as if to say, "Now steal 1 grain if you can." If Matthew was vexed, it did not show. He set about his work, whistling tunelessly. "Oh, look at that now," he interrupted. "I've started work without an apron." And he slipped downstairs on the excuse of fetching one. Untying the reins of the 2 horses at the hitching rail, he gave their rumps such a thwack that they did not stop running until they were 5 fields away. Then Matthew returned to his mill room and observed nonchalantly to Bright and Spark, "Surely you didn't come on foot with such a heavy load?" "No," they said, "on horseback." "Well, where did you put them? I saw no horses in the yard." It took them all afternoon to catch their animals, and by the time they crawled back to the mill, Matthew had finished grinding their corn and stood at the door, his thumbs tucked in the armholes of his smock. At his feet lay a saggy, half-empty sack. "How tedious for you boys. I wonder how they got loose. Still, here's your flour, and finer ground than you'd get from any mill in the south of England." "But we brought 2 big sacks of corn," Spark protested despairingly. "Ah, well, lots of husks, you know. An awful lot of husks on that breed of corn." Bright glared murderously at the miller. But what could he say? A miller would lay his hand on the Bible and swear a cow had 5 legs. So Bright and Spark took their miserable scraping of flour and left. They did not go far. From the end of the lane, they doubled back and hid in the miller's barn till nightfall. While clouds smothered the moon, they crept into the house and up to the miller's bedroom. A new baby was snuffling and scratching in the crib at the foot of one bed. The bed of the miller's wife, of course. In the other, Matthew lay tangled in blankets like a pig in a parcel, snoring. In bare feet, Spark and Bright crept to the cot and lifted it across the room to the foot of the miller's bed. Then they padded back to the door and coughed and rattled the latch and said, "Burgle, burgle, burgle," in low voices. Matthew only turned over in his sleep and sucked his thumb, but his wife's eyes opened as wide as sunflowers, and she kicked off the blankets. She was a huge woman, and when she lifted the distaff that stood against the wall, she was as huge and white as a ship's foresail with the bowsprit in front. Through the house she crept, in search of the burglars, but Bright and Spark were giggling together in the press, and she found no one. Only when she returned to the bedroom did she see the crib. At the foot of the bed, and a shape in the bed. She raised such a hullabaloo that the mill race froze in terror. "Hide in my bed, would you? You villain! Hide in my own bed! There, take that for your impudence, and that for your villainy, and that for your burglary." As Bright and Spark crept down the stairs, the miller's whimpers were rising to a roar, punctuated by the blows from the distaff and the wife's furious shrieks. "And that for the shame you've brought on your poor mother, and that." They left hastily, but not so hastily as to leave 2 fat sacks of flour from the miller's own larder. I hope I told that correctly. I admit, I had some trouble hearing the Reeve story. This might have had something to do with the miller playing his bagpipes all the way through it. As Oswald finished his story, he rode with dignity up to Matt and asked if he could borrow the bagpipes. "Just for a moment, dear friend." Matt handed them over warily, knowing Oswald would never dare to hit him with them. We were just then crossing the river as Oswald trotted over the bridge. He tossed the pipes lightly over the wall. They sank with a splash, then bobbed to the surface again and sailed downstream, as stately as a Viking funeral ship. "They put me in mine," said the sea captain sentimentally. of a privateer's schooner I once sank in the Skagerrak." The parson went and retrieved them. When the 100 of who came into sight, we had lunch at an inn. Since the incident with the bagpipe, several of us had been asking the sea captain for a story. We relished the idea of a sailor's yarn of pirates and sharks and the like. He told us a long story about a careful merchant and his wife who overspent on the housekeeping. There was not one drop of the sea in it. The merchant said it was wonderful, a great contribution to the body of English literature. Personally, I would have preferred a pirate story. The troop of horses straggled out, single file, picking their way among deep boggy cart ruts, then forked left at a signpost. We looked round just in time to see one poor, thin beast shambling off on the other road. Its rider, the scholar from Oxford, had his head in a book, and was quite unaware of losing us. Harry Bailey shook his head. "He'd be in Maidstone before he'd even notice," he said, then galloped off to haul the scholar's pony back into line. "Now come on, lad. Set your studies to one side. There's a time and a place for everything, and this is the time and here's the place for your story. Don't say you don't know any. The way you read, you must have seen every word a pen ever wrote." The scholar looked round at us, as vague as a man just woken from a deep sleep. "Look at that." "Bless him," said the widow in the hat. "I don't suppose he's remembered to wash his neck or eat a bite of food since he opened that book." "What's so good about it, love? You can't put it down? Is it naughty? The scholar blushed and helped up the book. "It's only mathematical astronomy." He blinked, like an owl at us, until Harry reminded him about the competition. Then he said, "Well, if you care for a contribution from someone so inarticulate and lacking in proficient handling of the dramatic forms fundamental to the narrative tradition." "Is he talking Latin?" said the human. "No," said Hubert, "but I'll be damned if it's the English my mother taught me." The scholar blushed again and went back to his book. "Tell us a story, boy, and keep your long words for impressing your pupils," said Harry, clapping the scholar on the back. His thin shanks pony buckled at the knees. Obviously, the lad spent his money on books before clothes for himself, or hay for his horse. "I went to Italy last year," he said slowly, as if he was picking the easiest words he knew. "And I read a story while I was there. Would you like to hear that one?" A cheer went up from the troop of writers. "What did he say?" asked the widow in the hat.